Listen, in 1973, in a small corner of the Arkansas Ozarks, a woman named Mrs. Hattie Gable stood over a blackened cast-iron kettle, stirring a thick, amber-colored syrup with a hickory paddle she'd smoothed down over 40 years of labor. She was making sorghum taffy, a ritual she had performed every autumn since she was a girl in 1932, back when the smell of wood smoke and the sound of pressing cane were the only signs that winter was coming to the hills. Her taffy had won blue ribbons at the county fair every single year from the late 50s to the early 70s, a streak of perfection that seemed as permanent as the limestone bluffs surrounding her home. But in 1979, a large-scale candy factory opened up just 2 counties over, flooding the local general stores with brightly wrapped, machine-molded corn syrup chews that cost half of what Hattie needed to charge just to keep her fire going. She couldn't compete with the hum of the assembly line. Her kettle grew cold. The hickory paddle was tucked into a dark corner of the pantry, and 100 years of mountain alchemy simply stopped. That sorghum taffy is a story we will revisit later on this list, but it's just one fragment of a much larger American map that is slowly being erased from our collective palate. The history of the American kitchen isn't found in 5-star restaurants or gleaming test kitchens in New York City. It's buried in the heavy, grease-stained pages of church basement cookbooks and etched into the seasoned walls of cast-iron skillets passed down through 3 generations of farmwives. We are talking about a time when sugar was a luxury, when the sweet at the end of a long day of logging or plowing was built from the humble scraps of the pantry: stale bread, a bit of rendered lard, the last of the winter apples, or the sediment at the bottom of a cider barrel. These 25 forgotten desserts were once the heartbeat of the American home, found on every Sunday table from the fog-drenched coasts of Maine to the sun-baked plains of the Texas Panhandle. They were the dishes that sustained the lumberjack in the North Woods and the sharecropper in the Delta, providing the high-calorie fuel needed for a life of physical grit. Now, before we dive in, let it be clear that this is a journey through history, not a piece of medical advice or a guide on how to change your current diet. We are here to remember the flavors of the 1970s and much earlier, the dishes that defined our ancestors but are now fading into the shadows of processed convenience. Number 25, Indian pudding. To anyone outside of New England, the name might sound like a relic, but in the cold, salt-sprayed kitchens of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, this was the ultimate winter survival food. It wasn't a delicate custard, it was a heavy, slow-baked masterpiece made from cornmeal, milk, and molasses, seasoned with ginger and cinnamon until it took on the color of dark mahogany. The secret was the time. It had to sit in the oven for 5 or 6 hours, often overnight in a cooling hearth, until the cornmeal absorbed the liquid and transformed into a dense, porridge-like texture that stuck to your ribs. In the 1970s, you could still find a crock of this on the back of a wood-burning stove in rural Vermont, usually served with a scoop of vanilla ice cream that melted instantly into a white river against the dark, spiced grain. But as the pace of American life accelerated, the idea of waiting 6 hours for a pudding became an absurdity, and today, most young people would walk right past a bowl of it, never realizing they are missing the very taste of the early American frontier. Number 24, vinegar pie. Often called the poor man's lemon pie, this was the ultimate achievement of Depression-era resourcefulness in the Midwest and across the Great Plains. When the Dust Bowl made fresh citrus impossible to find or far too expensive for a family living on a failing wheat farm, mothers reached for the one acidic thing they always had in the cellar: apple cider vinegar. By whisking a few tablespoons of vinegar with sugar, eggs, flour, and butter, they created a custard that, once baked, miraculously mimicked the tart, bright snap of a lemon tart. In the 1970s, this was still a staple of the make-do kitchen in states like Kansas and Nebraska, a testament to a generation that refused to let poverty strip them of their dignity or their Sunday treat. It is a humble, pale, yellow slice of history that tells the story of survival through ingenuity, yet it is rarely seen today, replaced by frozen pies with ingredients that no farm wife of the 30s would recognize. Number 23, boiled cider pie. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in the hollows of Kentucky and Tennessee, the harvest didn't just mean apples. It meant cider that was boiled down for hours until it became a thick, syrupy concentrate known as cider jelly. This was the base for a pie so intense and tangy that it could wake up the tiredest worker after a 12-hour shift. The syrup was mixed with spices and poured into a flaky lard crust, baking into a translucent, amber-hued filling that tasted like the very essence of autumn concentrated into a single bite. In 1975, a slice of this at a roadside diner in West Virginia might cost you 75 cents, a small price to pay for a recipe that required days of wood fire boiling. Now, the old cider presses are mostly decorative lawn ornaments, and the art of boiling down the harvest has been traded for high-fructose corn syrup, leaving the boiled cider pie as a ghost in the memories of the oldest mountain residents. By the mid-1970s, something was shifting in the American soul, and it started in the kitchen. The yellowed ledger books on the farm tables of the Ohio Valley and the Great Plains were bleeding red. Small family operations that had survived the Dust Bowl were being swallowed by industrial giants. And with that economic squeeze came a new kind of social pressure, the shame of the poor table. For decades, American families had prided themselves on making something from nothing. But as the suburban dream expanded, those old high-calorie staples started to look like relics of a hardship people wanted to forget. The scratch of a pencil against a kitchen table as a father calculated the cost of diesel and seed was often followed by the mother quietly tucking away the recipes for stretch meals. To serve a guest a dessert made of crumbs and molasses felt like admitting you were losing the war against the new, shiny decade. The heavy, steam-filled kitchens were being traded for the hum of the microwave and the sterile convenience of the A&P freezer aisle. Number 22, shoe-fly pie. In the Pennsylvania Dutch country, particularly in the rolling hills of Lancaster and Berks counties, this wasn't just a dessert. It was a breakfast staple for men who spent 12 hours behind a plow. It was a bottom-of-the-barrel masterpiece, built from nothing but flour, brown sugar, lard, and dark molasses. There were no eggs, no milk, and certainly no fancy fillings. The wet bottom version featured a gooey, syrupy layer that soaked into the crust, topped with a thick mountain of sandy crumbs. In the early 1970s, an Amish or Mennonite grandmother would bake 6 of these at a time, the smell of burnt sugar wafting across the barnyard. But as the younger generation moved toward the cities, shoe-fly pie began to be viewed as peasant food, too heavy, too sweet, and too evocative of a life of manual toil. By 1978, the pre-made, gelatinous fruit pies of the supermarket had pushed the shoe-fly to the back of the pantry, and a recipe that once fueled the building of the American East began to wither away. Number 21, persimmon pudding. This is the dark, dense secret of the Indiana woodlots and the southern Illinois river bottoms. Unlike the airy, light sponges of the city, this was a heavy, moist, almost fudge-like slab that required the foraging of wild persimmons after the first hard frost. In 1974, a family in rural Indiana might spend an entire Saturday in the woods, shaking trees to gather the soft, orange fruit that had to be hand-pulped through a sieve. It was a labor-intensive ritual that produced a pudding so rich it almost tasted like a brownie made of mountain earth. But as the 1970s progressed, the foraged nature of the dish became a mark of the past. Why spend a day in the mud when you could buy a box of chocolate cake mix for 50 cents? The wild persimmon groves were cleared for housing developments, and the knowledge of which trees produced the sweetest fruit died with the grandfathers who once guarded those spots like gold mines. Number 20. Alabama Lane Cake. This was the undisputed queen of the Southern social ladder, a towering, high-calorie monument made famous in literature, but born in the hot, humid kitchens of the Deep South. It was a white sponge cake layered with a filling so rich it was practically a meal in itself. Egg yolks, butter, sugar, raisins, and a heavy-handed splash of bourbon. Making a lane cake was a test of a woman's status and her stamina. It had to be made days in advance to let the liquor mellow and the filling soak into the grain. In the 1975 social circles of Montgomery or Savannah, serving a lane cake was a signal that you had the time, the help, and the pantry to honor tradition. But as more women entered the workforce and the pace of life quickened, the 3-day commitment to a single cake became an impossible luxury. The bourbon-soaked layers were replaced by whipped topping and canned peaches, and the authentic, boozy bite of the lane cake became a memory found only in the pages of old novels. Number 19. Appalachian Stack Cake. Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains and the hollows of Kentucky, this was the wedding cake of the working class. It wasn't one cake, but 6 to 12 thin, crisp layers stacked on top of one another with a thick filling of dried apple butter spread between them. The cake was built over days, the moisture from the apples slowly softening the layers until the whole thing became a single, dense, spiced tower. It was a communal effort. Neighbors would bring a single layer to the bride's house until the stack was high enough. In the early 70s, you could still find these at mountain reunions, their layers representing the strength of the community. But as the mountain youth sought lives in the factory towns, the art of drying apples in the sun and stacking cakes by hand began to fade. The convenience of a bakery sheet cake was the final blow to a tradition that had survived 2 centuries of mountain isolation. Number 18. Chess pie. Born in the kitchens of Tennessee and Virginia, this was the ultimate pantry pie. When the fruit was gone and the nuts were used up, a farm wife would reach for sugar, butter, eggs, and a handful of cornmeal to give the filling its signature snap. It was a golden, custard-like slice of pure American energy, often spiked with a touch of vinegar or lemon to cut the sweetness. In 1976, a slice of chess pie was the standard finish to a Sunday dinner after church. It was simple, honest, and incredibly cheap to produce. However, as the 70s brought an influx of modern, refrigerated desserts, the simple chess pie was often looked down upon as a desperation dish. People wanted complexity. They wanted imported ingredients and elaborate decorations. The golden, crackled top of the chess pie, which once represented the resourcefulness of the American heartland, began to disappear from the table, replaced by the uniform perfection of the industrial bakery. The spine of the old American table wasn't held together by fancy spices or imported oils. It was anchored by the discipline of the cast iron skillet and the smokehouse tricks of the rural South and the Midwest. In the 1970s, a kitchen in the Georgia red clay or the North Carolina foothills was a place of high-stakes chemistry where the primary fuel was white gold, pure rendered lard, and the primary sweetener was the dark, iron-rich sediment of the molasses barrel. Building these meals required a physical intuition that no modern cookbook can replicate. You didn't measure with a cup. You measured by the weight of the flour in your palm, or the way a drop of water danced and hissed across the surface of a preheated iron pan. It was a world of substitutions and stretching, where a handful of hickory nuts replaced expensive walnuts, and where the liquid from a jar of pickled peaches became the base for a cake glaze. This wasn't just cooking. It was an act of stubborn preservation against the encroaching tide of frozen dinners and instant mixes that threatened to make the hand feel of the American housewife obsolete. Number 17. Blackberry Slump. Up in the coastal towns of Maine and the Massachusetts Bay, this was the definitive stovetop dessert. It was a masterclass in the grunt, or slump, a technique where simple flour and lard dumplings were dropped directly into a bubbling cauldron of wild berries and sugar. There was no oven involved. The dish relied entirely on the discipline of the heavy lid and the trap steam. In 1974, you could still hear the soft huff of the steam escaping the pot in a seaside cottage, a sound that gave the dish its name. The dumplings had to be light as air on the inside, but purple-stained and chewy on the outside. If the fire was too hot, the bottom scorched. If it was too low, the dumplings turned to lead. It was a dish built on the memory of wood-burning stoves, but as the 70s brought electric ranges with their imprecise cycles, the delicate timing of the slump was lost, and the dish was relegated to the back of the New England history books. Number 16. Southern fried peach pies. In the peach orchards of Alabama and Georgia, the fried pie was the handheld fuel of the working man. The spine of this dish was the half-moon crust, made with so much lard that it crackled like glass when bitten. The filling wasn't fresh fruit, but dried peaches that had been rehydrated and stewed until they were a thick, tart paste. This was a smokehouse trick. Dried fruit lasted through the winter and held its shape better under the intense heat of the frying fat. In 1975, you'd see these cooling on a wax paper-lined windowsill. Their golden surfaces bubbled and blistered from the hot grease. But as the 1970s health crazes began to demonize animal fats, the lard was swapped for vegetable shortening. The crunch vanished, and the traditional fried pie was replaced by the uniform, tasteless, snack pies found at gas stations across the interstate. Number 15. Burnt sugar cake. This was the ultimate test of a baker's courage in the kitchens of the Ohio River Valley. The spine of the cake was the caramel, created by melting white sugar in a dry iron skillet until it turned a dangerous, smoking black amber. It was a terrifying process. 1 second too long and the sugar was ruined. 1 second too short and it lacked the deep, smoky bitterness that defined the cake. This was the American version of high-wire chemistry. In the early 70s, a burnt sugar cake was a point of pride at a Kentucky church social. Its frosting a shimmering, tan silk that tasted like a toasted marshmallow. But the skill required to burn sugar without burning the house down was a hand no that wasn't being passed to the daughters of the 70s, who preferred the safety of a box of yellow cake mix and a tub of canned frosting. Number 14. Appalachian potato candy. During the leanest years in the mountain towns of West Virginia, when the flour barrel was empty, mothers looked to the root cellar. This candy had no grain at all. Its spine was a single, leftover boiled potato mashed with a mountain of powdered sugar until it miraculously turned into a stiff dough. This dough was rolled out, slathered with a thin layer of peanut butter, the cheapest protein available, and rolled into a log. In 1977, a child in a coal mining camp might find a slice of this in his lunch tin, a sweet, earthy treat that cost pennies. It was a miracle of substitution, a way to turn a vegetable into a luxury. However, as the 70s progressed and the shame of the potato grew, families stopped making this desperation candy, opting instead for the mass-produced chocolate bars that were becoming ubiquitous even in the deepest hollows. Number 13. Scrapple with molasses. Though often seen as a breakfast meat in the mid-Atlantic states like Delaware and Maryland, the sweet version was the traditional finish to a winter workday. The spine of scrapple was everything but the squeal, pork scraps boiled with cornmeal and buckwheat into a dense brick. The trick was the cast iron sear, slicing it thin and frying it in its own fat until the outside was a dark, savory crust. Then came the American drizzle, a heavy coating of dark molasses or maple syrup. It was a high-calorie bridge between dinner and dessert, a way to get every last bit of energy out of the pig. In 1973, this was the staple of the working-class kitchen, but the sheer poverty of the ingredients made it a target for the 70s modernization. People wanted clean meats, and the dense, molasses-soaked brick of scrapple was pushed off the table, leaving a hole in the American palate that has never quite been filled. The true record of the American kitchen was never written in ink. It was etched into the grain of the rolling pin and whispered in the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against a ceramic bowl. When we look at the history of what we ate in the 1970s, there is a profound tension between the memory and the record, between the grandmother whose hands knew the exact moisture of the air and the corporate mascot on the side of a cardboard box. In the archival records of the Great Plains or the Deep South, you'll find the names of industrial food scientists and marketing executives who invented the quick mixes that save time, but the names of the women who spent 40 years perfecting the ratio of salt pork to beans are almost entirely erased. This was the era of the Great Silencing, where the muscle memory of the American farmstead was traded for the sterile instructions of the printed page. The history of the working-class meal is often credited to the companies that packaged it, while the people who actually built the flavors, the domestic workers in the Carolinas, the logging camp cookies in the North Woods, and the nameless mothers of the Dust Bowl, have their contributions buried under layers of glossy advertising. Number 12, sweet potato pie. In the coastal plains of North Carolina and across the Black Belt of the South, this pie was a sacred record of survival. While the history books often credit the Southern Belle archetype with the refinement of the dessert table, the true credit for the sweet potato pie belongs to the Black women who transformed a humble root vegetable into a silken, spiced masterpiece that rivaled the finest pumpkin custards of the North. They didn't have thermometers. They knew the pie was set by the way the steam rose in a specific, curling pattern under the dim lantern light of a summer kitchen. In the 1970s, you could still find these pies cooling on back porches from Birmingham to Raleigh, their crusts crimped by fingers that had picked the very tubers they contained. But as the decade closed, the record shifted. The frozen, mass-produced yam pies of the supermarket took over the narrative, and the specific, smoky, hand-mashed texture that defined a century of Southern resilience was flattened into a uniform, sugary paste that bore no mark of the hands that created it. Number 11, New England apple pandowdy. This was the dowdy sister of the elegant tart, a dish where the crust was intentionally broken or dowdied during the baking process so the spiced apple juices could bubble up and soak into the dough. It was a dish of the Maine woods and the New Hampshire hills, a rugged, messy celebration of the harvest. The memory of the pandowdy is one of thrift, using the bruised apples in the scrap ends of the pie dough. Yet, in the 1970s, as the record of American rustic cooking began to be commodified by fancy city cookbooks, the pandowdy was often erased or cleaned up into a neat, lattice-topped pie that lost the very soul of its construction. The dowdying was seen as unrefined, a mark of the poor, and so the authentic, soggy-bottomed, high-calorie joy of the original disappeared, replaced by a version that looked better in a photograph but tasted like nothing at all. Number 10, Kentucky jam cake. Deep in the bluegrass region and the limestone hills of Kentucky, this was the record of the pantry's end. It was a heavy, dark cake made with blackberry jam folded directly into the batter, producing a moist, dense crumb that felt like a hug from the inside out. It was a cake of the common folk, often served at wakes and weddings when the fresh fruit was long gone. In 1974, a slice of jam cake at a funeral in Lexington was more than a dessert. It was a testament to the family's history of preservation. But the records of the big flour companies in the late 70s didn't have room for jam as a primary ingredient. They wanted you to buy their pre-flavored mixes. The jam cake, with its deep purple hue and its earthy, spicy bite, was erased from the modern Southern repertoire, relegated to the handwritten cards tucked into the back of Bibles. Number 9. Suet pudding. In the timber camps of the Pacific Northwest and the iron mines of the Upper Peninsula, the record of a man's worth was often measured by how much cold he could endure, and that endurance was fueled by suet pudding. This wasn't a light sponge, it was a steamed, tallow-based brick of energy, filled with raisins and molasses and cooked for hours in a tin over a roaring wood stove. The memory of the cookie, the camp cook who worked in the shadows, is what kept this dish alive. By the mid-70s, suet had become a dirty word in the American vocabulary, associated with heart failure and the shame of animal fat. The record was scrubbed clean, and the high-octane fuel that built the bridges and railroads of the West was replaced by diet puddings that couldn't keep a man warm for 10 minutes in a December blizzard. Number 8. Boiled chocolate wacky cake. This was the ultimate erased dessert of the American heartland. Born in the Depression when eggs and butter were non-existent, it used vinegar and baking soda to create a chemical reaction that made the cake rise. It was a miracle of the working-class kitchen, a way to give a child a birthday cake when the cupboard was bare. In 1976, it was still a staple for families in the Rust Belt who were feeling the squeeze of the recession. But because it didn't come from a classic pastry tradition, it was never given its due in the culinary records. It was seen as a cheat cake, a wacky anomaly. The industry preferred to credit the rise of the chocolate cake to the development of the perfect commercial cocoa powder, ignoring the genius of the mothers in Ohio and Pennsylvania who used science in desperation to keep the sweetness alive on a table that was otherwise breaking under the weight of the times. Listen, we have spent this time walking through the steam of kitchens that no longer exist, but the final truth of the American table is that the most enduring flavors were often born from the hardest times. And we return now to that hickory paddle in the Arkansas Ozarks. Before we reach the final summit of this list, we have to look at the foundations that held the working-class house together during the long winters and the lean years of the 1970s. These were the dishes that bridged the gap between a light dinner and a cold night. The high-calorie anchors that ensured a body had enough warmth to survive until the morning whistle blew in the factory or the sun rose over the frost-covered cornrows of the Midwest. These recipes weren't just about indulgence. They were about the stubborn refusal to let the spirit go hungry even when the wallet was empty and the local mill had stopped its engines. Number 7. Maine salt pork and beans. To the uninitiated, this might look like a simple side dish, but in the lumber camps of the North Woods and the coastal villages of New England, the Saturday night bean pot was a dessert in all but name. The pork was cured in heavy salt, but the beans were submerged in a sea of dark molasses and brown sugar, slow-baked in earthenware crocks until the fat rendered into a translucent, sugary glaze that coated every bean. It was a dense, iron-rich comfort that tasted like wood smoke in history, providing thousands of calories to men who burned them all before the noon sun hit the treetops. Number 6. Rhubarb Brown Betty. In the upper Midwest, from Minnesota to the dairy farms of Wisconsin, the pie plant was the first sign of life in the spring. This wasn't a delicate tart, it was a Betty. Layers of tart rhubarb smothered in butter-soaked breadcrumbs and maple sugar, baked until the fruit collapsed into a crimson jam and the crumbs became a crunchy, golden roof. In 1974, this was the sound of a screen door slamming and a family gathering around a warm pan in a farmhouse kitchen. But today, the wild rhubarb patches are often mowed over for suburbs, and the Brown Betty is a stranger to the modern American palate. Number 5. Sourwood honey cakes. Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia and the Carolinas, the sourwood tree produced a honey so distinct it was prized like fine wine. And these cakes were the vessel for that mountain gold. They were small, dense, and incredibly sweet, built to be carried in a pocket for a long day of timber work or foraging. They were the energy bars of a previous century, still found at Appalachian roadside stands in the mid-70s for 20 cents apiece. The honey gave them a floral, slightly spicy note that no refined sugar could ever replicate. Number 4. Buttermilk pie. In the sun-scorched kitchens of Texas and Oklahoma, when the fruit trees died in the heat and the pantry was down to the basics, the buttermilk was the hero. By whisking tangy buttermilk with sugar, eggs, and a heavy dash of nutmeg, farm wives created a custard of the plains that was as rich and silken as any cream pie from a fancy city bakery. In 1976, it was the standard finish to a Sunday pot roast, but as buttermilk became a specialty store item rather than a farm byproduct, the pie began to vanish from the American table. Number 3. Northwoods bread pudding with whiskey sauce. In the logging camps of Michigan and the Pacific Northwest, bread was never thrown away. It was reborn as a high-calorie masterpiece. Stale loaves were soaked in a mixture of heavy cream, eggs, and sugar, then baked in massive pans to feed 50 men at a time. The payoff was the sauce, a warm, buttery slurry spiked with enough cheap whiskey to keep the chill of the forest at bay. Number 2. Soda cracker pie. This was the ultimate mock apple pie of the Great Plains and the American Heartland. When the apple crop failed during the lean years, mothers used soda crackers soaked in a lemon tart syrup to mimic the texture and flavor of a fruit pie. It was a beautiful deception, a way to keep a family's spirits high when the world was gray. In the 1970s, it was still a kitschy favorite at church suppers in Kansas, a reminder that an American mother could make a miracle out of a box of crackers. Number 1. Mrs. Hattie's sorghum taffy. We return to the Ozarks, to the woman with the hickory paddle. The pulling of the taffy was the social event of the season. Men and women would grease their hands with butter and stretch the warm, dark sorghum syrup until it turned from a deep brown to a shimmering pale gold. This was the American silk, a candy that tasted like the earth itself, concentrated and clarified by fire. In 1973, that taffy represented 40 years of Hattie's life, a labor of love that was more about the community than the profit. When the factory took her market, it didn't just take her income, it took the pulling, the shared laughter, and the hand-to-hand tradition that bound the hills together. These episodes are mere snapshots, compressed versions of a history that took centuries to build and only decades to forget. But in every bite of a forgotten pie, we reclaim a piece of that lost American map. Tell me in the comments which of these flavors still lingers in the back of your mind from your grandmother's kitchen.